Hello. So this is the first of a series of videos that we're going to be doing on Aquinas' famous five ways, his famous five proofs of the existence of God. These are from his Summa Theologiae. In this first video, I will make some general comments about the arguments, background to understanding the arguments, the general strategy of each argument, and so forth. And then in five subsequent videos, we'll work through each one of the five ways in order. And then there'll be a wrap-up video at the end where I will respond to various questions that people might have, that viewers might have about the arguments. So again, the five ways are five famous arguments for God's existence that Thomas Aquinas puts forward in the Summa Theologiae, very early in the Summa Theologiae. And it's very important to understand at the outset that these arguments were meant, as Aquinas presents them in the Summa, as summaries of lines of argument that Aquinas develops elsewhere and that other writers had developed over the centuries, really, prior to the time Aquinas was writing. And they're meant really merely as summaries. They're not meant as one-stop shopping presentations of arguments that would all by themselves, in isolation, be absolutely convincing even to the most hard-nosed skeptic. The way these arguments are often presented in contemporary philosophy, the way they're excerpted in anthologies, for example, where you'll get just these 2 pages from the Summa Theologiae setting out the five ways, is therefore highly misleading, and it has indeed misled many people who think that what Aquinas was intending to do was to give a complete case that answered every objection and anticipated every possible line of criticism. And that's not, in fact, the case. And so it's no surprise that someone who reads the arguments out of context thinks, oh, well, there are all sorts of objections I can think of that Aquinas doesn't even address. Why is anybody impressed by these arguments? But again, they're being taken out of context. Aquinas didn't mean for them to be a standalone piece of writing. Okay. In particular, there are objections that might be raised to the arguments, and there are background philosophical assumptions Aquinas makes. And then there are further lines of argument intending to show, for example, that the God whose existence he's argued for in the five ways has all of the divine attributes of being omnipotent, omniscient, and so forth, where he addresses those matters other places in the Summa Theologiae and in other works as well. And so all of that is missed when we read these arguments out of context. And so when people think, again, Aquinas just didn't even bother to note or to respond to such and such an objection that a reader can think of just on reading the arguments, that's unfair because they weren't meant to stand alone, but to be read in this larger context. Okay. The arguments have a long history. For example, the first way, which is the argument from motion, I'll say more about that in a moment, but the argument from motion to an unmoved mover goes back at least to Aristotle. Aristotle presents it in a couple of his works, in the Physics and in the Metaphysics, and indeed there's a version of that sort of argument, of a very similar argument, presented by Plato, Aristotle's teachers, in the Laws, his dialogue, The Laws. So that goes back, 1,500 years before Aquinas was writing. So that argument has a very long history. Other arguments, like the third way, the argument from contingency to a necessary being, that argument of Aquinas is often taken to be a variation on an argument given earlier by the Islamic philosopher Avicenna. And the other arguments, too, have precursors in the history of philosophy. So these are not arguments that Aquinas himself came up with or spun out of whole cloth. Rather, the arguments exist within a longer tradition that readers in his day would have been familiar with. And so if they're reading the five ways in the 13th century, the average student of theology might say, oh, yeah, okay, this is the Aristotelian argument from motion. I know where Aquinas is going with this. Or, oh, this is Avicenna's argument from contingency. Okay, I get the idea here. And would, to at least to some extent, be able to, mentally plug in the gaps, as it were, in the brief overview or summary that Aquinas gives in the five ways. And so it's important to read Aquinas not only in the context of the Summa Theologiae as a whole, to read the five ways in that context, and not only to read the five ways in the context of Aquinas' larger body of work, the Summa Contra Gentiles, the different commentaries on Aristotle he wrote, and on, but it's also important to read Aquinas' five ways in light of the longer philosophical tradition, going back earlier in medieval scholastic philosophy, but ultimately all the way back through not only Christian, but Islamic and Jewish philosophy, and back to ancient Greek philosophy. There's a lot you can say to understand the arguments without getting into all of that. I don't want to give the wrong impression that somehow you have to be an expert in the history of philosophy to make any sense of the arguments. That's not true. That would be an exaggeration. The point is just to emphasize that there is a larger context to these arguments that includes this history of philosophy going back to the ancient Greeks. And it's in that larger tradition that some of the objections that someone might raise to the argument, you'll find they've already been responded to, or some of the gaps in argumentation where Aquinas presents things in kind of a sketchy way in one or more of the five ways. That gap's been filled by other writers in the history of the arguments that Aquinas and his readers would have had in the back of their minds as they're considering the five ways. Okay, so that's a little bit of general stage setting of context to keep in mind when considering the five ways. To be a little more specific, in understanding the five ways, it's crucial to understand that there's certain philosophical assumptions Aquinas is making when he presents the arguments. I don't mean that he's just making these assumptions in a groundless way. He's not. But when you consider, for example, the first way, which is the argument from motion to an unmoved mover, or the second way, the argument from efficient causality to an uncaused cause, or the third way, the argument from contingency to a necessary being. I'll explain what all that means in a moment. You find that Aquinas is operating with a certain understanding of what motion involves, or of what cause and effect involves, or of what it is to be a material object, a physical object. And he develops all that in other places, both in the Summa Theologiae and in his larger body of work. And he just applies it when giving these arguments for God's existence. Modern readers are typically unfamiliar with these background philosophical assumptions that Aquinas makes. And so they don't, when they see him use a word like motion or a word like cause, they don't necessarily understand all of the background that enters into Aquinas' use of those terms, that he's using them in a technical sense, where if you understand that technical sense, you would know, oh, and now I see why he's drawing this inference. Yet if you don't know it, you wouldn't see why he's drawing the inference, and the inference might even seem to commit a fallacy when in fact it does not. Now, when I've presented these arguments myself in books like my book on Aquinas, and I discuss some of them in other places, like my book, Five Proofs of the Existence of God. In some of those cases, I will start out in an earlier chapter, say, setting out the relevant background philosophical ideas, Aquinas' theory about the nature of motion or change, his account of the nature of causality, and so forth. And then only after doing all that, in later chapters, I'll go on and present the different arguments, the first way, the second way, and so forth. That's one way to do it. But in this little video series here, that's not really the most efficient way to do it. And so the other way to do it is, as we go along in discussing each of the five ways, I will introduce the relevant background metaphysical concepts, philosophical concepts relevant to that specific argument. So for example, as we discuss the first way, I'll get into exactly what Aquinas means when he talks about motion or change, and how that plays a role in his presentation of the argument. However, let me make some, at least very general comments about each of the arguments, just to give us kind of an orientation here before we look at each of them individually in greater depth in the subsequent videos in this series. So the five ways basically go as follows. This is the basic strategy. I'm not going to give you each of the arguments, but I'm going to give you the basic strategy or point of each of the arguments, and then we'll pursue each of them in detail again in subsequent videos. The first of the five ways is, as I've indicated, often called the argument from motion to an unmoved mover. And so here are the strategies to show that the motion or change that we experience in the world around us, whether it's the sun rising in the morning, or the fan spinning above me, I can kind of see it in the camera here, or me just talking and moving my mouth, moving my hands, and so forth. The change or motion that we see around us in the world every day, in everyday experience, could not exist at all unless there was something that was keeping all of that motion or change going from moment to moment without itself undergoing any change at all, an unmoved mover. So the first way, again, is known as the argument from motion to the existence of a divine unmoved mover of the world. How that works, we'll look at in our next video and spell it out in detail. So I haven't given the argument, but just the overall strategy of the argument. The second way is known as the argument from causality, sometimes, to be a little more precise, the argument from efficient causality. And I'll explain what that means. Efficient causality, just to give you a quick answer, is the kind of causality involved when one thing brings another into existence or alters or changes it in some way. Okay, as when you write something on paper and you've altered the paper by putting these words onto it. Or again, as I'm doing right now, I'm talking and so I'm generating sounds and generating images as I speak into the camera here. And so I'm the efficient cause of those effects. Okay, so the second way is known as the argument from efficient causality to the existence of an uncaused cause of the world. And here the idea is that the argument's going to try to show that nothing could be caused to exist at all unless there was something that was causing, as it were, the existence of everything without itself being caused, without being an uncaused cause. All efficient cause and effect patterns that exist in the world around us presuppose something that causes all of it without itself being caused. Okay, we'll spell that out in more detail later on, but that's the basic strategy of the second way. Then we come to the third way, which is known as the argument from contingency to the existence of an absolutely necessary being. Here the basic idea is this. We see in the world of our experience every day things coming into being and passing away, what medieval philosophers called generation corruption, coming into existence and passing away. And that's possible, only for things that are contingent, meaning they do exist, but they didn't have to. And their existence is contingent upon or dependent on other things. That's what it is to be contingent. And the argument is going to try to show that there couldn't be things that are like that, things that are contingent, that exist but didn't have to, and that's why they come into being and pass away. There couldn't be things like that unless there's something that's not like that. Something that's not contingent, meaning it could not have not existed. It exists in an absolutely necessary way. Okay, so that's the basic strategy of the third way, the argument from contingency to a divine an absolutely necessary being, something that could not have not existed. We'll spell that out in more detail in a later video. Then we come to the fourth way, which is known as the argument from the degrees of perfection to the existence of a supremely perfect being. Here, the argument starts out by noting that we observe in the world around us, the world of everyday experience, that things exhibit degrees of goodness, degrees of truth, degrees of being or reality. How could something exhibit a degree of reality? Well, we'll explain that a little bit later on. But things exhibit degrees of goodness, truth, reality, and the argument tries to show that they couldn't exhibit these degrees of these features unless there was something that had being, truth, reality, goodness in the maximum possible way. A maximally perfect being that was supreme in goodness, supreme in being, supreme in truth, and by reference to which everything else counts as having only some particular degree of goodness, truth, reality, and so forth. Okay, we'll spell that argument out in greater detail in a later video. Finally, we have the fifth way, which is the argument from finality to a divine supreme intelligence or supreme intellect. What's that all about? Well, finality, also known as final cause, that's an idea that goes back to Aristotle, has to do with the way that something aims or points beyond itself to some end state of some kind. For example, the acorn points or aims beyond itself toward becoming an oak tree. Or the sulfur in a match aims or points beyond itself toward generating flame and heat when you strike the match. Okay? And so we find in the world of our experience that things exhibit these tendencies toward a certain kind of end state. They exhibit what Aquinas calls finality, or philosophers also call it teleology, or final cause, which involves being aimed or directed toward or pointing towards some end state or goal. And this exists wherever we see regular patterns of cause and effect in the world. You plant the acorn, it always grows into an oak tree. It doesn't grow into a cat or a Volkswagen or something. You strike the match and it generates flame and heat. It doesn't turn into a bouquet of roses or something. So we find regular patterns of cause and effect whereby causes are aimed or directed at or point towards certain characteristic effects. And what Aquinas wants to argue in the fifth way is that this couldn't happen, this couldn't be the case, unless there were some supreme intellect or divine mind that is aiming things or pointing them toward these outcomes or toward these effects. How's that argument supposed to work? Well, we'll look at that in greater detail. Okay. So those are the 5 ways. Again, first, the argument from motion to an unmoved mover. Second, the argument from efficient causality to an uncaused cause. Third, the argument from contingency to a necessary being. Fourth, the argument from the degrees of perfection to a most perfect being. And fifth, the argument from finality to a divine supreme intellect. Now, as I say, we're going to look at each of these in some detail in subsequent videos, but let me now make some general comments addressing certain very common objections to the arguments right out of the gate, the minute somebody first hears them, which are based on misunderstandings, and misunderstandings of precisely the kind that I warned about at the beginning of this video, where I said that it's important properly to understand the arguments, that they are read in context. The context of the Summa Theologiae as a whole, the context of Aquinas' larger work, and indeed the context of the history of philosophy that led up to Aquinas. And these misunderstandings that I want to briefly address here basically derive from a failure to read the 5 ways in this context, this larger context. Okay. Now, the first of, and I'm going to talk about 3 very common misunderstandings. And the first of them, and one that's my personal pet peeve, something I've written about a lot, is the objection that goes like this. It says, oh, okay, I know what Aquinas is trying to do in these arguments. What he's trying to do is to argue something like the following way, that everything has a cause, and so the universe must have a cause, namely God. And then the objection to that, so the argument continues, is obvious. And the objection is this, that, well, if everything has a cause, then why can't we ask what caused God? But then if Aquinas says, well, nothing caused God, then why can't we just say nothing caused the universe either? And in that way, all these arguments are sunk by an objection that could have been thought of by a 5-year-old. Well, that's a very common objection to these sorts of argument. But it's a very bad objection because it's aimed at a straw man or a caricature of the arguments. You'll notice that in none of the arguments, even as I've presented them so far, just in kind of a little outline, do we have this premise, everything has a cause, and then the inference, therefore the universe must have a cause. Aquinas never says that. And indeed, not only does he not say that everything has a cause, he would deny that everything has a cause. He doesn't, he's not committed to that premise. And not only, again, is he not committed to it, but he actually rejects that premise. What he actually says is not that everything has a cause, but in the first way, for example, that whatever is undergoing change must be changed by something else. But that's not saying everything is undergoing change and must be changed by something else. It just says if something is undergoing change, then that thing must be changed by something else. But that's not the same thing as saying everything has a cause. Or in the second way, he would say that what comes into being, what comes into existence requires a cause. But that's not saying everything has a cause. Compare if I said that all triangles have 3 sides and someone says, hey, what are you talking about? Squares don't have 3 sides, circles don't have 3 sides. So, Feser, where do you get off saying that all geometrical figures have 3 sides? I would say I never said that. I said triangles specifically. I didn't say every geometrical figure. And in the same way, Aquinas, in none of his 5 ways, says that everything has a cause. And indeed, he would reject that supposition for reasons we'll talk about in later videos. So that's a very common objection, but it's just aimed at a straw man. That is to say, in a straw man in logic A straw man fallacy is committed when you object to an argument that the person you're criticizing never gave. You're objecting to some cartoonish distortion of their argument rather than the argument they actually gave. And when critics object to, raise this objection, if everything has a cause, what caused God, they're objecting to a straw man. That's an argument Aquinas never gave. And incidentally, it's not just Aquinas that never gave that argument. When you look at the history of arguments for God's existence more generally, going back to Plato and Aristotle at the beginning of, toward the beginning anyway, of Greek philosophy, through later ancient philosophy in thinkers like Plotinus, medieval philosophy from St. Augustine to Bonaventure, to Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and so forth. Early modern philosophy, Leibniz, Samuel Clarke, people like that, down to the present day. Nobody gives this dumb argument, everything has a cause, the universe has a cause. And when skeptics attack that argument, an interesting fact is that they never tell you where they got it. They never quote anybody as having given it. And the reason is that no philosopher or theologian in the history of those subjects ever gave that silly argument. So it's an urban legend. It's a straw man. Okay, so that's one common objection that is really, you don't even have to really know a whole lot about the Summa Theologiae or Aquinas' larger work to know that that's aimed at a straw man, because all you have to do is read the text of the five ways. You'll see he just never says that everything has a cause, so the universe has a cause. That's not his argument. The second of the very common objections that are based on misunderstandings is a bit more innocent, however. Here you do need to know something of the larger context of Aquinas' work and really of the way medieval philosophers and ancient philosophers often argued for God's existence in order to see that this second general misunderstanding is indeed a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding goes like this. The reader looks at the five ways and thinks, okay, well, what Aquinas is doing in all of these arguments is tracing the history of the universe back to a beginning and then asking, well, what caused that beginning? Like he's tracing it back to what we would today call the Big Bang, and then essentially asking what caused the Big Bang. And then the objection says, well, why suppose the universe had a beginning in the first place? Or even if it did at the Big Bang, maybe the Big Bang was caused by some preceding universe collapsing in on itself and generating ours. Or maybe our universe branched off from some pre-existing set of universes. It's part of a larger multiverse, say. And if that's the case, then we don't have to trace the history of the universe back to an absolute beginning. And that means we don't need to trace it to God. Okay, very common objection. But this objection, too, is aimed at a straw man. It's grounded in a misunderstanding of the nature of Aquinas' arguments. Though, in this case, as I say, it's a misunderstanding that's more innocent because someone who is uninitiated and reads the five ways for the first time might easily be led into this misunderstanding. In fact, though, Aquinas is not arguing in any of the five ways for a beginning of the universe. That's not the way the arguments go. In fact, Aquinas not only is not arguing in any of the five ways that the universe must have had a beginning and that God must be what caused that beginning, he actually denies that that's a good way to argue for God's existence. This was actually a debate in the Middle Ages, having to do, this debate occurred not only in Christian philosophy, but in medieval Islamic philosophy. And it had to do with whether the beginning of the universe was something that could be proven through philosophical arguments, or whether it could only be known through divine revelation. Aquinas happened to be someone who thought that the fact that the universe had a beginning in time, that it was only so old, it didn't go back forever, was not something you could know through purely philosophical arguments, but could only know through the book of Genesis. So we needed to rely on divine revelation for that. Whereas other thinkers thought that, no, you could prove through philosophy that the world must have had a beginning. In Aquinas' view, though, he thought, well, no, we can't prove through philosophy alone that the world had a beginning, but it doesn't matter for the project of arguing for God's existence, because you can demonstrate rationally through purely philosophical arguments without relying on divine revelation that God exists, even if the world had no beginning. In particular, what Aquinas is trying to show in the five ways is not that the series of causes traces backward to the past to a beginning of the universe and God is what caused that beginning, but rather that the series of causes operating here and now presupposes a divine uncaused cause operating here and now, sustaining the universe in being from moment to moment to moment. Aquinas' view, in other words, is that forget about how old the universe is and how it got started. That's not the deep question. The really deep question is what keeps the universe going from moment to moment? What keeps it from blinking out? Or what keeps it from grinding to a halt at any particular moment? And he wants to argue that the only way that we can understand how the universe keeps going from moment to moment is if there's a divine uncaused cause who continuously sustains it or conserves it in being from moment to moment. And if God weren't doing that, the universe would simply instantly disappear. We wouldn't be here having this conversation. And that can be proved through philosophical arguments, purely rational arguments without any reliance on divine revelation. And that this would be true even if the universe had had no beginning at all. So whether the universe had a beginning or not is, in Aquinas' view, irrelevant to arguing for God's existence. You don't even need to get into that. You can concede to the atheist that the universe has always been here and proceed to argue along different lines. Now, whether Aquinas is right about that is a matter that Thomists, followers of Thomas Aquinas, themselves dispute to the present day. Whether he was right, in other words, that you couldn't show through philosophy alone that the world had a beginning. But the point is that in the five ways, he does not even want to get into that issue. He's happy to concede for the sake of argument that the universe never had a beginning and argue that it doesn't even matter for proving God's existence. You can still prove that God exists through purely philosophical arguments without having to demonstrate the beginning of the world, because the key issue is that the world couldn't continue in existence even for an instant if God weren't continuously causing it and sustaining it in being. Just like, say, in a dark room, if you got a flashlight on, the spot of light on the wall couldn't continue in existence even for a moment if the flashlight were not continuously shining. And if you turn off the flashlight, the spot of light on the wall would disappear. In the same way, if God stopped causing the world at any particular moment, including here and now, the world would stop existing here and now. That's the kind of argument Aquinas is trying to give in the five ways. Okay, so that's a second misunderstanding. And again, it's more understandable because you wouldn't know just from reading the text of the five ways themselves, at least it wouldn't be obvious just from the text of the five ways themselves, that Aquinas is not trying to argue for a beginning of the universe. That becomes clear only when you read in the larger context and see both that he explicitly denies that is the right way to argue for God, but also he sets out his understanding of the nature of cause and effect, where when you understand how he thinks cause and effect works, you'll see that it couldn't be that he's arguing for a first cause in the sense of something that got, the Big Bang going 13 billion years ago, but rather he's arguing for a divine first cause operating here and now to keep the universe in existence here and now. Okay, so we'll come back to that issue. Then a third very common misunderstanding of the five ways goes like this. Sometimes critics will read the five ways and they'll say, okay, look, suppose we concede that one or more of these arguments works. Suppose we concede that in the first way, Aquinas really does get us to an unmoved mover of the world, or in the second way, he gets us to an uncaused cause, or whatever. Okay, fine. Well, Aquinas doesn't show that this first cause would be all-powerful, or would be all-knowing, or would be all good, or that there would be only one of them as opposed to 13 first causes, which wouldn't give you monotheism and so forth. So the argument continues, the objection continues. The five ways fail as a demonstration of the existence of God as traditionally conceived. But here, too, we have an objection that derives from the fact that people are reading the arguments out of context. Again, Aquinas didn't intend for the text of the five ways, which takes up just, like 2 pages in a modern anthology, to be standalone arguments that answer every objection or that justify every background premise of the argument. Those are matters he gets into elsewhere. And so if you think, well, I read the five ways and I didn't see where he argues for what are called the divine attributes, the attributes distinctive of God, like being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, etc. Well, he doesn't do it in the five ways, but he does do it in the rest of the Summa Theologiae, beginning immediately after the five ways. If you just turn the page, you'll see he immediately starts arguing that to be an uncaused cause of the world, to be an unmoved mover of the world, something would have to be all powerful, all knowing, all good. There could be only one of them. There couldn't even in theory be more than one, and so forth. And he sets out, literally in the Summa Theologiae and elsewhere, hundreds of pages of argumentation to try to establish that the God whose existence he's argued for in the five ways indeed has all of these divine attributes, and so fits the description of God as traditionally conceived. But you have to go beyond the five ways to see how he does that. He doesn't try to do that all in just 2 pages. He does it in all this other argumentation. Now, of course, obviously, you'd have to look at those arguments and see whether they work or not. And a reasonable person might read some of those arguments and say, well, I'm still not convinced. Okay, fine. But the point is that, excuse me, a lot of critics don't even know those arguments exist. They're not even aware that Aquinas addresses each of the divine attributes, God's being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, etc., in subsequent sections of the Summa Theologiae and elsewhere. So that this objection too, that, well, he gets you to a first cause, but he doesn't tell you that this first cause is unique, all-powerful, all-knowing. He does actually get into all that. He just does it later on in the book. Okay, so there too we have another objection that just derives from people not reading the five ways in their larger context. Okay, so that's a general orientation to the study of the five ways. So in subsequent videos, we're going to proceed to look at each of them in detail, beginning next time with the first way. Okay, so we'll see you then in that next video.